Hello, my name is Arnold, and you're welcome to my YouTube channel, Pawn to Pro, where I take it from beginner level interest to advanced level. We continue our series on beginner strategy, and today we'll be talking about pawn structure. Pawn structure. Like, subscribe, and share this video. Let's dive right in. You are now ready for your next step on the road to real chess understanding. How to plan. This video will focus on the strategic concept of the pawn structure using space. Using space. What does the term pawn structure mean? Some chess teachers also use the term pawn skeleton. I think it's more illustrative. What both of these terms mean is that if you strip the position of pieces and leave only the pawns on the board, you will clearly see how to plot your strategy. Taking the starting position of the pieces and leave only the pawns on the board, you will clearly see how to plot your strategy. So from the starting position here, if we remove all the pieces, we have a view of the pawn skeleton of a starting position. So this is the view of a pawn skeleton of a starting position. Remembering the ancient battlefield analogy, it stands to reason that if an opening of the ranks, if you could open the ranks of one of the enemy camp, you will flood in with your army ammunitions. And that will be a breach, will make a breach in our enemy's camp. And then we might capture the enemy's king or put them in a worse position. The open file. I remove both of white and black D pawns. The D file is open because there are no pawns on it. So this is an open file. Why are open files important? Why are open files important? Well, can you think of a piece that will benefit by sitting on an open file? From our previous lessons, can you think of a piece that will benefit by sitting on an open file? If you said rook or queen, you are right. Rooks love open files. This strategic principle only stands to reasons. Look at the next example. Rooks and queen love open files. Look at this example. Both sides, black and white, both sides have the same 7 pawns as before. I have just added a rook to each side. If it is white's turn to move, he should do himself an important strategic favor and move his a1 rook to the d1 square as quickly as possible. Why? Because on the d1 square, white rooks, white rook will be mobilized or developed to a position which would allow penetration into the opponent's camp. From black from black perspective, if it was his turn to move as well, he should try to use the same idea too. If he could move his rook from a8 to d8, then black rook will be developed on the open file, and he could be primed to shoot down the d file and invade white's position. Here is the same diagram with a slight change. The c2 pawn has moved a file over to the d2 pawn. Are there any open files? Are there any open files? There are no files that are clear of all pawns. There are no files. There are no files that are clear of all pawns. Thus the answer is no. There are no open files. From white perspective, he has an open file or a half open file on the C. This makes the C file open to white. But since black has a C7 pawn, the file is closed for black. The presence of only one pawn means that the file is half open. White should move his rook from a1 to c1, grabbing this half open file. Although the rook isn't as powerful on a half open file as it is on an open file, white has to make do. Not every position has an open file. In this case, white rook is best placed on the C file. Here is a pawn skeleton with rooks. What are the open files? What are the open files? There are none. What are the half open files? White half open file is the C file. This is half open file for white. Black has half open file is the E file. So there is white half open file and there is black half open file. Half open file for white, half open file for black. Do you notice how white's f2, e3, and d4 pawns are linked together? Do you see this link? Pawns that are linked together are called pawn chain. So this is a chain. In this pawn chain, the base pawn is f2. This is the base pawn. The base pawn is quite important since it is the foundation upon which the entire pawn chain rests. The base pawn, a pawn chain, the entire pawn chain rests on the base pawn. The strength or weakness of a pawn chain is determined by the base pawn. The strength and weakness of a pawn chain is determined by the base pawn. If it is strong, the pawn chain will remain powerful and intact. If it is weak, the entire chain is in danger of collapse. Let's now turn to black's pawn. In black's pawn structure, his pawn chain of b5, c6, and d5 has an unfortunate disadvantage. His base pawn c6 which sits on white's half-open file. This means that white rook shift over to the open file and put a lot of pressure on black c6 pawn. If the base pawn of black falls to the moves rook to c1 and rook captures c6, you can bet that the next move would be rook to c5, attacking both pawns. Then black's pawn chain will be wiped out as the b5 and d5 pawns both lack protection. So both pawns are under attack and they lack protection. Look again at this diagram. With our limited information, we now know we can already perceive that white moves rook to c1. White understands by bringing his rook to c1, he firstly develops his rook and secondly puts pressure on black's pawn structure, force him to respond. White moves his rook to the half-open file, placing the c6 pawn under pressure and forcing black to respond with either a rook move or if there was a king in the game, move his king. Black, aware that his pawn chain is in immediate danger, is quick to respond with rook to c8. This marks a concession. Both army leaders now know that black's rook would prefer to go to the half-open file. have open e5, but black has no time. If he were to play his rook to e1, or e8 rather, e8, in order to defend the c6 pawn with rook to e6, he would be too late. Black would have preferred to place rook to open file, half open file, and then place his rook to e6, but he will be very late, so he must make concession by placing his rook on c8. One white played rook to c1, attacking black base pawn. Inten black wanted to have an open file or half open file, place his rook to e8, and then trying to move it to e6 to protect the base pawn was a late move. White carried out his operations. Soon the rest of black pawn's structure will fall, or black's chain will fall. Thus the best way for black to protect his base pawn was to move his rook to c8. Here we can see that black c8 rook is tied down to the defense of a c6 pawn. Now. Why is this? The problem with the c6 pawn is that it can be protected by another pawn. The pawns that flank the c6 pawn are b5 and d5. Both of them have passed the c6 pawn, so they cannot protect the c6 pawn. The result is that the c6 pawn has been left behind. In chess balance, the c6 pawn is identified as a backward pawn. Backward pawns tend to be weak because they need the protection of other pieces. Backward pawns are very weak because they need to be protected by other pieces. backward pawn. Backward pawns are weak. Why are they weak? Because backward pawns cannot count on other pawns for protection. As a result, backward pawns are a liability to their owners. Backward pawns are liability. Why? Because they cannot be protected by other pawns. Several other points about this pawn structure should be clarified. The first thing is that white pawns are separated into two pawn islands. There's an island and there's an island. Why do I mean? Well, a file in this case, the C file, separates white pawns into two distinct groups. The first group, the A2 and the B2 pawns, form its own pawn island. There's a pawn island. The second group, the D4, E3, F2, G2, and H2 pawns, forms the second larger pawn island for white. So we have two pawns island separated by the C file. The concept of different pawn island is very important. The concept of different pawns islands is very important. The more pawn islands the player has, the weaker his position becomes. The more pawn islands a player has, the weaker his position becomes. The C file separates white pawns island into two groups. This is the first group. Second group. Once again, the reason for this is that pawns, being the weakest team members, require protection. If our pawns island are broken into smaller and smaller groups, their protection or their need for protection increases. And sometimes our ability to protect them doesn't equal their need. Black Black also has 2 pawn islands. The A7, B5, C6, and D5. Pawns make 1 island. The F7, G7, and H7 make up the second island for Black. In the question of Black first pawn island, it is important to note that Black's A7 pawn, while not touching the B5 pawn, is still part of the pawn island. Of course, the A7 pawn is not touching the B pawn, but this is still a pawn island. If Black didn't have a pawn on B, if this file was empty, the A7 pawn will have constituted a pawn island of its own. So a single pawn can make a pawn island if it doesn't have any connection or touching another pawn. One island, second island for Black. By looking at the pawn islands of a given position, a principle of how to play that particular position becomes clear. The player with more pawn island will have more difficulties in the ending than his opponent will. If you have more pawn islands in the end game, you have more difficulty with your game. Remember that pawns and pawns island require protection. As more pieces are exchanged, our ability to protect our pawns becomes less and less. Soon, the player with more pawn islands will have more to worry about. Remember that pawns and pawns island require protection. As more and more pieces are exchanged, our ability to protect our pawns becomes less and less. Soon, the player with more pawn islands will have more to worry about. A new position is created. I'm going to give you a new position very shortly. I would love for you to visually inspect this position and see if it's fairly balanced. Is this position fairly balanced? It is not. white has a near decisive advantage. The pawn structure seems to tell us that white has a pass pawn, the d5 pawn. The d5 pawn is a pass pawn because its path to promotion is not blocked by a black pawn. What is a pass pawn? A pass pawn is a pawn whose path to promotion is not blocked by an opponent's pawn. Or it matched up the board cannot be stopped by a black pawn. So this is a pass pawn. One of the one of the greatest chess players called Aaron Nimoswich said, "A pass pawn is a criminal who should be kept under lock and keys." Yes, but who will play the guide? A piece cannot be stopped by another pawn. So a pass pawn means that a pawn that is heading to promotion and cannot be stopped by another pawn or opponent's pawn. That's a pass pawn. This means that a d5 pawn is a pass pawn. And since another pawn cannot stop him, the d5 pawn has grown in value. Because a piece has to be stopped or a piece has to be assigned to stop the pawn from promotion. So the d5 pawn has grown in value. So pass pawns grow in value because they must be guided by a piece. Another analysis of this position shows that the d5 pawn is a protected pass pawn. The fact that it's protected by e4 pawn raises the status of the d5 pawn even more. A pass pawn will quickly promote itself if not washed by an opposing piece. Boom, move, move. Let's go over some drills to cement the principle or concept of pawn structure. In this drill, which weak capture by white is better? How should white capture the bishop? Don't forget, always capture towards the center. That is better. Capture towards the center. White to move. What is a desirable move for white? In this position, white to move. What is the desirable move for white? Rook to the open file. Rook love open file. For black, what is the desirable move? Black to move. Open file. Not the half open file. The full open file. White to move. Now, as white has gained control of the open file, where should white play? What's the next move? White to move. Now that white has gained control of the open file, where should he play? Taking control of the 7th rank. For black, now as black has control of the open file, why should he move? Taking control of the 2nd rank. Are there any open files? Are there any open files? There is a half open file, a half open file, half open file, half open file. So no, there are no open files. What kind of open file is this one? What kind of open file is this one? This is a half open file. Half open file. How many pawn chains? How many pawn chains does white have? 1, 2, or 3? 2 pawn chains. 2 pawn chains. How many pawn chains does black have? How many pawn chains does black have? 1, 2, 3. Black has 3 pawn chains. Just a single pawn chain. Because it's not connected to the other pawn by pawns, but rather a bishop. So black has 3 pawn chains. What type of pawn chain is this? Weak, strong, or neither? There's a weak pawn chain. Weak pawn chain. Very weak. But the base pawn is weak. What type of pawn chain is this? This is a very strong pawn chain. A very strong pawn chain. What is white next move? Or what do you suggest for white next move? Capture the base pawn. What is black move? Next move. Take the open file or capture the base pawn. Capture the base. Thanks for joining me on this video that was on pawn structure. As we continue our beginning strategy series, next we'll be going thoroughly on a rook on taking rook development, how to play with the rook, effectively how to play with the rook. Like, subscribe, and share this video. See you next time.